My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God.
Saint Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, a medieval nun, mystic, artist, healer, thinker, and Christian reformer, claimed to receive divine visions and inspirations, which she recorded and proclaimed by God's command. In some of her writings, especially works such as Civius, there are references to the future, the corruption of clergy and religious scholars, and major spiritual transformations. Hildegard did not directly specify a particular time or date for the end of the world. What appears in her works is a collection of symbolic and apocalyptic images that resemble apocalyptic literature. She speaks more about signs such as moral and religious corruption, the emergence of misleading leaders, social and spiritual crises, and ultimately the triumph of good over evil. Most researchers believe these texts are allegorical in nature and are intended as moral warnings and calls for reform in society, rather than precise predictions of the end of the world. Nevertheless, in her spiritual visions, Hildegard presents a powerful image of the world's destiny. In her view, this process begins with a gradual decline when humanity distances itself from truth and faith becomes an empty outward form. This decline is slow but steadily intensifies. Following this, the world enters a phase of chaos and instability. Wars, fear, and confusion spread, and in her words, darkness casts its shadow over the world. At the height of this crisis, the most dangerous development occurs: the rise of forces or individuals who claim to bear the truth, but in fact lead people astray. At this stage, distinguishing truth from falsehood becomes increasingly difficult, and a kind of anti-truth emerges. Hildegard did not directly specify a particular time or date for the end of the world. What appears in her works is a collection of symbolic and apocalyptic images that resemble apocalyptic literature. She speaks more about signs such as moral and religious corruption, the emergence of misleading leaders, social and spiritual crises, and ultimately the triumph of good over evil. Most researchers believe these texts are allegorical in nature and are intended as moral warnings and calls for reform in society, rather than precise predictions of the end of the world. Nevertheless, in her spiritual visions, Hildegard presents a powerful image of the world's destiny. In her view, this process begins with a gradual decline when humanity distances itself from truth and faith becomes an empty outward form. This decline is slow but steadily intensifies. Following this, the world enters a phase of chaos and instability. Wars, fear, and confusion spread, and in her words, darkness casts its shadow over the world. At the height of this crisis, the most dangerous development occurs: the rise of forces or individuals who claim to bear the truth, but in fact lead people astray. At this stage, distinguishing truth from falsehood becomes increasingly difficult, and a kind of anti-truth emerges. As darkness reaches its peak, the world enters a period of suffering and trial. This is not a state of destruction, but rather one of purification, a difficult process aimed at renewal and transformation. Then comes the turning point, the return of light. Truth is revealed once more, the forces of evil are defeated, and a form of spiritual renewal begins. At the end of this process, a final judgment takes place. Human deeds are revealed, and justice is established. In a brief summary, Hildegard's pattern can be outlined as follows. 1. Gradual decline. 2. Chaos and crisis. 3. Deception and misguidance. 4. Suffering and purification. 5. Moral collapse, violence establishing. 6. Spiritual struggling. 7. Judgment and justice. 8. Collapse before renewal. 9. Emerging of light and goodness. 10. Renewal. Ultimately, her narrative is less about the end of the world and more about human choice, a choice between light and darkness. In the Book of Divine Works, Hildegard of Bingen presents war not as a precise prediction of specific battles, but as a symbolic and moral consequence of human disorder. Her visions place war within a broader framework of cosmic and spiritual collapse. Here is a clear summary of her perspective on war in that work. 1. War as a consequence of moral corruption. Hildegard directly links conflict to human sin and moral imbalance. In her view, when justice, truth, and divine order are ignored, the fabric of society becomes unstable, and conditions for conflict emerge. War is not the root problem, but a visible symptom of a deeper spiritual and ethical disorder. Humanity, by turning away from righteousness, disrupts the harmony of creation, and war arises as a natural outcome of this imbalance, rather than as an independent cause of suffering. 2. Cosmic disorder reflected on Earth. A central theme in the Book of Divine Works is that the universe is a living, ordered system created by God with precise harmony. Human wrongdoing disturbs this balance, and its consequences extend beyond individuals to affect nature and society as a whole. In Hildegard's visions, war is not merely a human event. It reflects a broader cosmic disharmony. It is a sign of a larger collapse of order, one that encompasses both the natural world and human society. 3. War as punishment and purification. Hildegard often presents suffering, including war, not as something to be glorified, but as a form of divine correction and discipline. In her view, war can serve as a means to expose hidden corruption and prompt inner transformation. Within this framework, suffering and destruction carry meaning and function with a deeper spiritual process aimed at purification and the restoration of moral and divine order, even though this path is accompanied by pain and sorrow. 4. Forces of evil and deception. She also describes the presence of dark forces influencing humanity, leading both leaders and people into misguidance. In this sense, war becomes not merely a political conflict, but a spiritual struggle between good and evil. It is not the final outcome, but rather a stage within a larger process that ultimately moves toward restoration. After disorder and conflict, divine harmony is eventually reestablished. For Hildegard, war is the outward manifestation of an inner and cosmic imbalance, permitted as a form of judgment, endured as a process of purification, and ultimately overcome by divine will. 5. Humanity's turn toward violence.
When human hearts turn away from justice, They ignite the fire of destruction among themselves, and brother rises against brother in anger.
This is one of her clearest descriptions of war arising from moral collapse. Violence begins within and then spreads outward. The earth is shaken by human disorders, she believed.
The elements of nature are disturbed by humanity's deviation, and they respond with storms, destruction, and fear,
she declared. Here, war is part of a broader chain reaction. Harmful human behavior, understood as sin, disrupts nature, and chaos follows at every level. 6. Conflict as a spiritual struggle.
Darkness gathers its forces against the light, and many are drawn into this struggle without knowing whom they serve.
This statement reflects her view that wars are not merely political events, they are spiritual conflicts in which individuals may unknowingly align themselves with evil. 7. War as judgment.
God allows the proud to fall by the very sword they have raised, so that their deeds may be revealed before all.
According to this, war is thus portrayed as a form of judgment and revelation. Violence exposes the corruption or moral failure underlying human actions. 8. Collapse before renewal.
In those days, kingdoms will tremble, and people will fall into confusion until the order of justice is restored.
In her view, war and chaos are a transitional phase that precede the restoration of divine order and justice. In this process, it should be noted that light does not directly engage in conflict with darkness. Rather, it assumes the role of an observer. It is darkness itself that struggles across its various dimensions, and from within this struggle, a form of purification emerges. This purification creates the conditions for the manifestation of light. At that point, light establishes itself and reveals its presence. Therefore, any battle or war that occurs should not be seen merely as a confrontation between light and darkness, but often as an internal conflict among different aspects of darkness itself. 9. Emerging of light and goodness. Light requires a suitable foundation in order to manifest, and until this purification is completed within darkness, such a foundation does not come into being. The appointed time is the moment when this foundation has been established, purification has been completed, and light is ready to emerge and be revealed. After the emergence of light and goodness, the process does not end with revelation alone. It naturally leads into renewal. Once light has become manifest, it does more than simply illuminate. It restores, reorders, and gives new life to what has been purified. Light, as described, could not appear until a suitable foundation was formed within darkness through struggle and purification. When that appointed time arrives, when the inner ground has been prepared, light emerges and reveals truth. But this revelation is not merely an act of seeing, it initiates transformation. In stage 10, renewal occurs as a direct consequence of illumination. What was disordered becomes ordered. What was hidden becomes integrated into clarity. What was fragmented becomes whole. The darkness, having undergone its internal conflict and purification, no longer resists light. Instead, it becomes capable of receiving and sustaining it. This is why renewal is not imposed from outside. It arises organically from within the very process that prepared the ground. Thus, renewal is not a separate event, but the fruit of revealed truth. When truth is seen, it restructures perception, action, and being. The individual, and by extension humanity, enters a new state of alignment, where clarity replaces confusion and coherence replaces fragmentation. In this final stage, the cycle reaches fulfillment. Indeed, light does not merely appear, it establishes a new order. This is restoration, not a return to the past, but the emergence of a transformed reality, grounded in truth. Light does not engage in struggle, it only observes. Yet this observation is influential. It gives direction to forces and guides them toward a purposeful path, toward what is right. And what is the right purpose? It is the one that leads toward purification. Purification, then preparation, and finally invocation. When light becomes manifest, evil is defeated. But how can evil be defeated in a conflict of evil against evil? In such a struggle, both sides are defeated. At the same time, both sides may also become transformed. How is this possible? It occurs when each side of evil comes to recognize its own nature. When this recognition happens, that moment becomes the time of the revelation of light, because seeing requires light. Light has come so that true seeing may take place. Therefore, in a conflict between two aspects of evil, light is not absent. Light is present, but as an observer. Darkness, in order to purify itself and to prepare the ground for the emergence of light, drives itself into conflict. However, light itself does not enter the struggle. It only observes. In sacred texts and religions, waiting is described for human beings, but this expectation is two-sided. It is also waiting on the part of light. Light waits to be revealed, waits to disclose truth. It longs for darkness to be made ready for the recognition of truth. Therefore, during conflict and the struggle of evil, one should not assume that light is absent. It is present, but it only observes. In John 4:43-54, we read that Jesus went to Cana in Galilee, where he had turned water into wine. A royal official, whose son was ill, was there. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. In this context, illness can be understood as a struggle within darkness, seeking the emergence of truth, a truth that must be revealed both to the Father and the Son. Jesus said to him,
"Unless you see signs and wonders, you will never believe."
Notice that Jesus refers to seeing. Seeing implies the presence of light. Seeing a sign is the first step toward perceiving the deeper truth. Jesus casts light onto the darkened ground of the minds of the Father and the Son. When he says, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will never believe," he means that truth must first be seen for healing to occur. What has been hidden must be brought into the light so that it can be seen, and only then can purification take place. Then the royal official says to him,
"Lord, come down before my little child dies."
This statement shows that he has acknowledged Jesus as his Lord. When he says, "Before my child dies," he is expressing the inner struggle, evil manifested as illness in the Son and fear of loss within the Father. By saying "come,"
He is, in effect, invoking the presence of light.
After a while, Jesus replies,
Go, your son will live.
and the man believes the word and sets out on his way. When Jesus tells him to go, he points to the unfolding process of truth becoming revealed within the Father. On the journey back, the Father will see, for it is said that he believed and went on his way. Upon reaching his son, he finds him healed, and Jesus' words, "Your son will live," are fulfilled. This reflects a sequence of stages, a process rather than a mere narrative, seeing, believing, acting, and ultimately the manifestation of truth and healing. The man believes. His belief allows his heart to open and receive light. When light is received, truth becomes visible. As the Father returns on his journey, he perceives the unfolding of truth. While he was still on the way, his servants met him and reported that his son had recovered. He asked them at what time the boy had begun to improve. They replied, "Yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him." Then the Father realized that it was at that very hour Jesus had said to him that his son will live. This moment is the appointed time, the moment when light meets the darkened ground. In truth, the son's illness was rooted within the Father as well. The son struggled against illness, and the Father struggled against the fear of losing his child, both confronting their own shadowed aspects. The son wrestled with disease, the Father wrestled with grief and the possibility of loss. This struggle and suffering brought about purification. Purification invites light, and in that light, seeing occurs. Truth is revealed and healing takes place. This is a mechanism that operates across all dimensions of human life on earth. Jesus says,
I can do nothing on my own. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me.
John 5:30. Here, it becomes clear that Jesus is like a transparent channel through which light shines. He functions like a lens, focusing light. He illuminates blind spots and dissolves blockages, constrictions, and hardened areas, bringing expansion and openness. For this reason, he is called the Savior, because he possesses the capacity to concentrate light and expose and purify hidden darkness. In doing so, he removes the root of evil. This is what salvation means. However, there are others who can allow light to pass through them and serve merely as channels of light. But Jesus functions like a lens. He gathers and concentrates light, where he says, he distinguishes between a temporary light and a more profound, inherent testimony. John is described as a lamp that reflects and emits light, while Jesus embodies and concentrates it so that the works themselves become the living testimony of divine origin and purpose. You who choose darkness have never heard his voice nor seen his form. His word does not remain in you because you do not believe in the one whom he has sent. You search the sacred scriptures thinking that through them you will find eternal life. Yet these very writings testify about me, says the Lord. You seek guidance and truth within books and texts, while the living God stands among you. He shines the living light upon you and reveals the way, yet you do not see him. You imagine yourselves as your own saviors and strive to save your lives, fighting, plundering, and casting others out in order to prove that you are the ones in power. But it is better that you pause and reflect on what you are doing. Is it not true that you will soon leave your bodies and die, and all your desires will come to an end? For this perishable body, which will ultimately return to dust, you have waged countless wars and conflicts. For years you have used human knowledge and power to invent weapons of mass destruction. You have employed the knowledge granted to humanity to destroy God's creation. You have invested the wealth and blessings of life in creating, accumulating, and stockpiling instruments of mass killing, only to unleash them every few years upon the lives of innocent people, seeking to prove how dark, corrupt, and distant from light you truly are. Yet the very knowledge upon which you rely to build weapons tells you that every action has its consequence. By your ignorant conduct, you contaminate your own children and future generations, forcing them to bear the burden of repairing the damage you have inflicted upon God's creation. This is the depth of your ignorance and folly. You lead your own descendants into destruction, believing that through killing you will gain freedom and rise to power. But you do not realize that the boomerang you release today will one day return to you. And perhaps this is the very warning that is repeatedly echoed in Hildegard of Bingen's visions, a world that, through ignorance, corruption, and estrangement from truth, descends into darkness, will inevitably face the consequences of its own actions. From her perspective, this cycle of decline and suffering is not meant for destruction, but for awakening and purification, so that through the most severe trials, truth may once again be revealed and light may replace darkness. In this process, no deed remains hidden, and divine justice is ultimately established, so that humanity may understand that salvation and true elevation do not lie in destruction and domination, but in returning to truth, embracing responsibility, and consciously choosing the path of clarity, away from deception, ambiguity, and confusion. For the path of God is simple and clear.